Did Kyiv admit to shelling its own civilians? Is the Netherlands holding Ukraine responsible for shooting down Malaysian Airlines flight MH17? And why is Russia so obsessed with Ukraine? Welcome to StopFake, the place where we debunk Russian disinformation about Ukraine. I'm Marko Suprun with another Set Their Record Straight digest, so let's get to it. Russian media pounced on Ukrainian presidential spokeswoman Yulia Mendel, twisting her poor choice of words into an alleged admission that Ukraine's military is killing Donbas civilians in eastern Ukraine. StopFake has repeatedly debunked similar Russian claims. In this case, Mendel's comment was taken out of context, and Russian media claims that Ukrainian soldiers target civilians are simply not true. In her very first television appearance, President Zelensky's newly appointed press secretary, Yulia Mendel, took part in a political talk show on the 1+1 Ukrainian television channel. She spoke about the Minsk process and whether or not Ukrainian soldiers are allowed to shoot back in response to being fired upon by Russian military or their proxy forces. Mendel said that ceasefire terms are outlined in the Minsk agreement, but those terms apply to both sides, and it's impossible for Ukrainian soldiers to unilaterally stop shooting while the other side continues to do so. Very often, Ukrainian military are shot at from residential areas, from kindergartens, schools, and hospitals, from places where there are civilians. Subsequently, these buildings are shelled, resulting in the death of Ukrainians. But the reality is that Ukraine's military does not target civilians. Military journalist and volunteer Serge Marko points out that Ukrainian soldiers only fire upon clearly delineated geographical coordinates using maps that show where civilians might be present. If they are, Ukrainian soldiers do not shoot, he points out. Volunteer Roman Donik, who monitors the fighting in the occupied Eastern Territory, says Ukrainian soldiers keep track of which buildings are hospitals and schools. If identified targets are civilian buildings, the Ukrainian army does not fire. Viktor Shidlyuk, the deputy director of Ukraine's General Staff Research Department, wrote on Facebook that, quote, "We never shoot at schools and kindergartens." In contrast, Russian armed militants have actually admitted to using Donbas civilians as cover to launch provocative attacks on the Ukrainian armed forces. The former leader of the self-proclaimed Donetsk People's Republic, Ihor Girkin, said his men regularly hid behind civilians in 2014 in Slavyansk, using them as human shields. Finally, the Ukrainian Defense Ministry and the Bellingcat citizen journalist group have recorded many instances of Russian proxy forces shelling residential areas in the Donbas. Last month, RT wrote that the Netherlands has not ruled out Ukraine's involvement in the downing of Malaysian Airlines flight MH17, while the online newspaper Vzglyad went even further, claiming that Ukraine was one of the organizers of the attack on the airliner. Gazeta.ru unequivocally declared that Ukraine was responsible for the airplane's destruction. MH17 was shot down by Russian militants on July 17, 2014 over occupied Donetsk. All 298 passengers and crew on board were killed. The source of these latest fake claims is Thierry Baudet, the chairman and founder of Forum for Democracy, a conservative, populist, and Eurosceptic political party in the Netherlands. Baudet is a pro-Russian politician and tends to take Russia's side on most issues. Baudet has tweeted that Ukraine is not a country and has disseminated some of the most notorious Russian fakes about Ukraine. During the 2016 Dutch referendum on the EU-Ukraine Association Agreement, Baudet actively campaigned against closer political and economic ties between the EU and Ukraine. During television debates with Dutch Prime Minister Mark Rutte on the eve of the recent elections to the European Parliament, Baudet advocated for the withdrawal of the Netherlands from the EU and for closer ties with Russia. During the same debate, Prime Minister Rutte called Baudet a Russia lover and challenged him to recognize Russia's aggressive policies. The discussion took a sharp turn when Baudet took Russia's side on MH17 and said he does not believe the results of the international investigation into the disaster. The official position of the Netherlands remains the same. Russia's involvement in the attack on the flight MH17 has been proven. The missile used to destroy MH17 was deployed by the Kremlin into occupied parts of Donbas. After one of the missiles was fired, the launcher returned to Russia. It's no secret that Russian state media outlets prefer to divert attention from domestic issues and instead focus their reports on Ukraine. The Kremlin is very obsessed with Ukraine. So how serious is Russia's fixation with Ukraine? And can it be measured? Well, the state news agency RIA Novosti's own website provides concrete answers. In a recent discussion on Twitter initiated by Alexei Kovalyov, editor at the alternative Russian news outlet Meduza, participants used the search function on RIA Novosti's website to measure RIA's obsession with Ukraine. It turns out that in 2014, during the first year of Russia's war against Ukraine, 29% of all RIA Novosti's national and international reports contained the keyword Ukraine. That's 50,019 individual news items devoted to Ukraine. RIA Novosti has since calmed down, and the total number of reports in the last 12 months shrank to 26,720 stories, or around 12% of all of its reports. Kovalyov launched this mini-investigation in reaction to a statement made by Margarita Simonyan, the chief editor of RT, Sputnik, and RIA Novosti. On her Telegram account, Simonyan said that, quote, Ukraine is becoming interesting again, even if audiences, according to Ms. Simonyan herself, have become sick and tired of hearing about Ukraine. So why bash Ukraine so mercilessly? Since Russia invaded Crimea and eastern Ukraine in 2014, Russian authorities have been caught in communication limbo. On one hand, Moscow denies responsibility, but as overwhelming proof of Russia's involvement in the war surfaces, the Kremlin needs to find ways to justify its aggression. It does so by denigrating Ukraine as a nation, by systematically misrepresenting events in the country, and by framing Ukraine's partnership with the EU as similar to Nazi Germany's expansion in the Second World War. So why the lies and obsession? Well, if the Kremlin loses control over Russian media narratives about Ukraine, more and more Russians could potentially look to their Ukrainian neighbor for inspiration as a place where presidents come and go, and showing Russian viewers there is in fact a viable alternative to the authoritarian model of governance practiced in Russia. Radio Liberty illustrated this difference in a video comparing newly elected Ukrainian President Zelensky's inauguration ceremony with that of his Russian counterpart. See if you can spot the differences. That's it for this week. You can find much more dissected disinformation on the StopFake website. Be vigilant, look out for fakes, and if you spot any disinformation about Ukraine, forward it to us for a truth autopsy. I'm Marko Suprun, and this is StopFake. Thanks for watching.